It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
There were things that we found that weren't revealed before the election. That's what lies behind today's statement from the Chancellor.
This is just them setting a narrative for tax rises that they want to bring in later on, but actually they took over an economy that had the fastest growth in the G7.
As the Chancellor prepares to make a statement to MPs, who's right about the state of public finances?
The Department of Transport says something has to be done to sort out the traffic problem.
That project, 30 years in the making, looks likely to be deemed unaffordable. Some new hospitals might have to be cancelled too. But public sector workers are likely to get an above-inflation pay rise.
I will step down as party leader, not immediately, but once the formal arrangements for selecting my successor are in place.
3 weeks since Rishi Sunak's resignation, the 6 candidates for Tory leadership emerge. The latest, Kemi Badenoch. And the new Labour government have put the Tories' law on free speech on campuses on hold. Joining us today, Labour's Sarah Edwards, Shadow Women and Equalities Minister Mims Davies, Stephen Gethins from the SNP and the Deputy Leader of Reform UK, Richard Tice. This is Politics Live. Yes, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is set to make a statement, a long, detailed statement, we're told. This is outlining what the Labour government says is the mess in Britain's finances that they've inherited from the Conservatives. Rachel Reeves wants to be as open, transparent and honest as possible, she says, about the scale of the financial challenge facing the Labour government. Let's start with their tweet. The Labour Party says the Tory left Britain's finances in their worst state since the Second World War. This Labour government will take tough decisions to deliver the long-term solutions that will make you better off. And this headline from a Telegraph piece by the Conservative MP for West Suffolk, Nick Timothy. Labour is telling the biggest lie in politics. It cannot get away with it. To pretend the books are worse than expected is not just shameless, it's an insult to the British public. Sarah, let's start with you. Who's right, Nick Timothy or the Labour Party?
Well, you know, it's been Rachel Reeves' mission since she was taking up her position to look through the finances of this country and to make sure that what she finds, as we know later on, she will be reporting back. It's really important that we are honest with the British public about the situation that we have inherited, and that is one of, you know, low growth, of terrifyingly awful public services that have been underfunded for years. And so making sure that with the mandate that we have from the British public, we set that back on track. It's going to take tough decisions, and that is what Rachel will be laying out later on
But the dispute is that this was all known about. The books are open. The Office for Budget Responsibility had set out all of the figures. So what's changed?
Well, the difference is that when they've opened the books and they've looked through the departments and all of the different ministers have said there are lots of things that were unfunded and that didn't have a cost basis for them. So actually the picture was worse than expected once they got there to have a look and interrogate the findings.
Mims?
Well, I think we had a very honest manifesto about the reform and the change that we were going to bring in to continue with our focus on making sure that we keep taxes down. What you're seeing from the new Labour Chancellor, Rachel, reaching for the tax lever, Reeves, is she's rolling the pitch for that. You're not hearing anything about reform. Labour has talked about being anti-NIMBY and pro-building. What they are proving to be is a government of blockers, again hoodwinking the government.
Yeah, but Mims, come on.
And this is a whopping great majority on a whopping great lie.
Right, well, you say it's a whopping great lie, but what about the honesty of the Conservatives in a campaign where they were promising tax cuts? And just last week, the now Shadow Chancellor told the Shadow Cabinet that they weren't going to happen. They wouldn't have been able to bring those in the autumn. So that was a whopping great lie.
So I think we've been very clear. For example, have you heard anything about benefit reform and tackling?
No, but on that question, why is it that you promised tax cuts during an election campaign that immediately afterwards?
That we're the party of low taxes. We of course brought in the national insurance reduction, which people are starting to see. We're a party that believes in people people spending their own money in the way that they choose
Got one of the
to.
highest tax
And
regimes
reform.
since the war at the moment. You know, and on this, Jo, it's all very George Osborne in 2010 that ushered in years of austerity. This is what he did immediately after the general election. Now, SNP researchers are excellent, but I'm sure Labour researchers are excellent as well. And when the SNP raised £18 billion worth of cuts were coming down the line, they were told by Labour colleagues and Conservative colleagues, you're talking nonsense, there will not be any new austerity. We told you this, you knew it was coming. Where we got it wrong, in fairness, we warned of 18 billion. And then, in fact, you want to deliver 20 billion. So we got it 2 billion out.
Well, we haven't actually laid out, you know, there are different reports, but the 20 billion hasn't been announced because we don't know what to do.
So
That's for Rachel to announce this
This is
afternoon.
completely contrary to what you promised in the election. You said there weren't going to be tax raises, but in reality, you've had access to the books in the Treasury, in the OBR, for weeks and weeks and weeks as part of the transition if a new government is likely to come in. And the reality is now, you're just fibbing to the British people. I think the British
We're
people
not fibbing.
You're absolutely
We have
You're
put
saying
in
it's a
an
black hole.
ironclad
but
commitment not to raise
you're saying
national
it's a black hole.
insurance,
It's not a black
tax
hole.
or VAT. That will not change.
Don't you say it's a black hole and that Labour...
No, I'm saying Labour are claiming it's a black hole. What I'm saying is that they had open access to the books, and now they're trying to con the British people, saying this is just an excuse for more tax rises. I tell you what, though, the idea that they're going to stop new hospitals being built and they claim to want to improve public services and improve healthcare is pretty remarkable. I wonder if that's really what we're going to hear this afternoon.
Sarah?
Well, we have set out an ironclad commitment that we're not going to be raising VAT, national insurance or income tax. We've said that clearly. We also know that we have to look at what is fiscally responsible. So what can we afford? And we are looking to primary care, for example, to make sure that where NHS budgets are being spent are in the places where we could be saving more money. Because a lot of people, if they can't get a GP appointment, they end up in hospital.
Well, we're going to talk...
Don't
worry, because we're going to come on to all of this. You will have a chance to question and answer what I put to you. But before that, let's talk to the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. You may have heard, Simon, welcome first of all, you may have heard some of the discussion here. Who is right? Can you bring some clarity on, did Labour cover up a 20 billion black hole? The government cover up a 20 billion pound black hole, and has Labour been fibbing throughout the election in terms of what they may have to do in terms of tax rises?
Can I just roll back just one little bit to set expectations for today? What this is not going to be is the answer to that discussion you were just having about which taxes are going to rise and when. This is going to be, if you like, a reckoning, a bring out your dead reckoning moment, which Sue Gray has had a lot of influence on, former senior civil servant at the Cabinet Office. And they will identify projects that were in train, in year, which are either unfunded or underfunded, and there will be a pretty detailed list of those. And the ones that we think may get the chop include things like the Stonehenge underpass. That seems to have been a plan for as long as Stonehenge has been around. I think it might have been phase 2 of the original design. There's also the A27 Arundel bypass. There's also the Lower Thames crossing. Now, all these projects are quite big, some quite big numbers surrounding them. I'm told that the HS2 bit from Old Oak Common, where it's meant to end at the moment, to Euston is not up for grabs, because actually the original plan was for private sector to really fund that, so there wouldn't be such a big saving. Now, the question is, can you, £20 billion, the question is, the OBR is tasked with basically looking through the books and coming up with their forecast. But what I'm told is that the OBR hands are pretty much tied in answer to those questions you were asking before. If the government says we're going to spend 10 billion quid on this, the OBR has to take it at its word, and it's only going through line by line through departmental spending budgets, which have been vaguer, I'm told, in more recent years, that some of these nasties emerge. Now, is £20 billion the right number? I don't know. Will Rachel Reeves even mention that number? That is not clear. But there will be some capital spending projects. What this won't be, as I say, is which taxes are going to rise and when. She's going to save that for a budget, which I'm told is going to be in October. Cutting against that, of course, is the fact she's likely to approve above inflation pay rises for some public sector workers. And there's reports this afternoon of a breakthrough for junior doctors as well.
Yes.
So that's going to be a tension. How do you marry the one thing against the other? How do you say you're builders, not blockers, when you're spending money over here, when you're saying that economic growth is your number one priority?
Right, well, you've just mentioned it. Let's just show our panel and viewers this headline in The Times. Junior doctors offered 20% pay rise to end strike actions. I understand that would be over 2 years. BMA recommends £1 billion deal to members. You can see here, in terms of the choices that are being made, Simon, they are going to be set out in broad outline, aren't they, this afternoon?
Yeah, and the question that a lot of economists have raised is, can you have above inflation pay rises without that being inflationary? We know that junior doctors wanted 35%, where Streeting said that's just unaffordable. Steve Swinford at the Times, as you say, is reporting on some breakthrough potentially there. But 5.5% for other public sector workers when inflation is at around 2%. I'm told that by economists that as long as public sector pay awards are not bringing up or dragging up private sector wage deals, then you can be two things at one time. You can be above inflation, but not inflationary. And Rachel Reeves will make the point that there is an economic cost to things like industrial action. There's been a lot of that in the last 12 months or 2 years. And she'll say you have to balance those things. But a really difficult thing for her tightrope for her to walk. She wants to become this example of fiscal rectitude, in contrast to what she says Liz Truss did, in contrast to what she said were irresponsible national insurance cuts by the last Chancellor when he knew there were some of these shortfalls. But at the same time, can you do that? And at the same time saying, we're going to bolster economic growth, we're the builders, not the blockers. On today's news, she may be seen as one of the scrappers, because a lot of these projects may get the boot.
Simon Jack outside the Treasury, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's pick up on that with you. Sarah, is this austerity 3.0? If you're going to start cancelling, if the Labour government is going to start cancelling projects, like some of the building projects, like the building of new hospitals, it's going to be austerity all over again?
Absolutely not. What we've set out is a manifesto for change. We've set that out very clearly, and we've already begun that work. So we've scrapped offshore wind, for example, so that we can get elements of that moving. We set up the National Wealth Fund so that we can get investment into the economy and work alongside businesses who haven't had a foundation that was clear to them so that they could be investing. And
but would you support the cancellation of the sort of road projects we have just heard? The cancellation of many of the 40 new hospitals, perhaps, if not all of them. How do you get growth if you're not going to build, putting aside housing, because we haven't yet seen the detail, if you're going to start cancelling projects?
Well, they're reviewing projects so that they can make the best decisions. And of course, where we have had projects that are not been funded properly, where they haven't got the relationship between what the money is there to provide, they do need to say what it is that we can do.
The choice they're making is to embark upon a public sector wage spiral upwards. The idea that they might give doctors an extra 20%, public sector across the board.
How do you stop the strikes, Richard? How do you stop the strikes that are damaging?
What you should be doing, is lifting the income tax threshold for everybody, so that you make work pay for everybody.
How much does that cost, Richard?
Well, actually, so our policy was very clear, and that would cost about 40 billion. You pay for that.
40 billion pounds. How would you pay for it?
The Bank of England is voluntarily paying interest on the printed money that it doesn't need to do. Why aren't they making that choice, as opposed to embarking on an inflationary wage spiral?
All right, well, hang on, Stephen. You must support the idea of meeting public sector demands in terms of above inflation wage increases, because that will stop the strikes.
Well, it has stopped the strikes in Scotland.
Yeah.
It's the
So
only part of the United
support
Kingdom.
that?
Well, the first thing I'll say, just on the point of austerity, and I want to come to your point on wages. I mean, frankly, if it looks like austerity and smells like austerity and tastes like austerity, it's austerity. I'm not sure how you're going to do it. This is austerity. Now, on the point on wages, Scotland is the only part of the UK that has not seen strikes because ministers have sat down. Now, in fairness, and I'll give Labour a little bit of credit there, it's good to see ministers sitting down with doctors and trying to tackle that head on. I'm not going to take any of the fantasy economics from the party that campaigned on leaving the European Union.
And
there's also a different way.
Richard, the only problem with talking over each other is the viewers can't hear, so they can't hear what you say as well as
And there's
Stephen.
also different ways of doing things. Labour are also maintaining Tory fiscal rules on these things. And if we look at capital, borrowing in terms of capital, we've also, according to the Labour mayor, Brexit's costing us £140 billion.
Stephen, you don't need to list everything that you've ever wanted to say against the Labour government. Let's pick up on your first point on austerity. Respond to what Stephen said in terms of this is austerity. It smells like it, it looks like it, it sounds like it.
No, because we've set out a very ambitious plan for growth for this country, and we've set out all the different things in recent days where we're going to be looking at the NHS and how we reform that, how we bring back a focus on primary care. At the moment, people cannot go back to work because they can't get a GP's appointment. That is hampering growth. growth. We do not have the houses in this country because they've not been being built. So we need to make sure we have social housing to address the issue across the housing market. We need to be preparing for the energy crisis properly, which means making sure that
reform the NHS if buildings are falling down, if the hospitals that they're working in are crumbling and you're not going to repair them?
Well, we haven't said we're not going to repair them.
Well, it's been widely reported that
they will be setting that out this afternoon in some of the projects that they will be announcing. That is Rachel's prerogative. I can't sit here and comment. I haven't seen those. But, you know, it is the responsible thing to do to say to the British public, this is the situation that we've inherited and these are the things that we would like to do to try to resolve that. But it starts
Let's get back to the black hole that was created, though, by a previous... Well, before you do, by a previous Conservative government. Look, Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies pointed out that the £20 billion figure, the black hole that Labour is talking about, is exactly the same as Jeremy Hunt's pre-election national insurance cut. Your government actually cut taxes that created this black hole.
We made it very clear in our manifesto that reform and tackling inactivity, not the party, but in the NHS and wider, as we came out of the pandemic and as we wanted to give people more money in their back pockets, that absolutely, and that investment that you saw in the most recent budget...
But that was after putting taxes up to a record high.
Well, we were very... I think this is about grown-up, honest politics here. We always said that COVID had cost over £400 billion, the reason that people have got their homes, jobs and livelihoods, and that had to be paid back. And what Labour are getting is a dose of that. They laid estimates before Parliament last week, which they'll have to adjust, potentially according to what the new Chancellor is doing today in terms of paving the way, and Simon said, storing up the tax rises for the autumn. But in the meantime, the Mottram bypass, the Arundel bypass, what you've just seen around Stonehenge. They're talking about building, but then taking away the infrastructure that my constituents and everybody's constituents around this table are saying they need to have.
Well, let Sarah respond. Let Sarah respond, and then I will come to you, Richard.
So this does not work.
Sarah?
Well, I disagree. Some of those infrastructure projects, the Conservative government didn't even get off the ground. So this is not a case that these were right in the middle of being built. This is about whether or not they were even funded in the first place and whether or not they would have brought about the economic growth. The example earlier was the Stonehenge example, which has moved nowhere for many, many years and actually is very controversial because of the World Heritage Site status that it has. So sometimes these things need to be considered and we can get growth in other ways. And looking at that infrastructure is what Rachel Reeves will be doing alongside Louise Haigh, who is the Minister
growth in the
at the moment.
That's the inheritance.
But remember that living standards were lower by the time of the election at the end of the Parliament than they were at the beginning for only the third time since the Second World War.
Joe, come on.
All right.
That's not an average
if you want above average, above inflation pay rises, you've got to link that to productivity improvements.
Exactly.
And there's no discussion about productivity improvements in the public sector, which has actually seen productivity in recent years under a Conservative government, frankly, collapse. There's 600,000 more public sector workers now than in 19, and yet actually outcomes are far worse.
But we were
hang on,
we were being realistic. We put benefits up between 10 and 8%. We were always mindful of the inflationary pressures, as you heard from Simon. So we'll need to hear from the Chancellor today how she thinks this can all be squared. And this is grown-up politics.
All right, well, how can... I'm sorry, I was going to come to you, but how can it be squared? How can it be squared, Sarah, if you are going to meet 5.5% pretty well across the board and not increase taxation?
We do not know yet what Rachel Reeves is going to set out, so we can speculate in lots of different ways. Yeah. But we've had it on pretty good authority.
They're going to meet the public sector pay recommendations, which are about 5.5%. That's before we get to the 20%. You've pledged not to raise the three main taxes. How do you square it?
We will look at the different ways of raising revenue. That's for Rachel Reeves to set out. However, we do need to make sure that people are paid properly, that our NHS workers are retained because they get a good wage to do that. We have seen them absolutely hammered. Yes. We've seen the rate of staff cut. That means that they're under strain. They got us through a pandemic, and I don't think that having had under-inflationary pay rises for over a decade, now talking about potentially what that is, whether it's 5.5% or something else, the fact is we need to make sure that people people in this country are paid properly and therefore can have a good standard of living.
But whatever happens, the burden's not going to fall on people who work, is it?
No, we have absolutely ruled out a rise in national insurance, income tax and VAT. That is absolutely not going to change. We were elected on that manifesto and we were elected with a very large majority from the British public.
People who work pay other taxes, don't they? So when you say it won't fall on people who work, what you're talking about are the taxes people pay in work, but other taxes could fall on people who work, can't they?
That has not been set out. That's not for me to decide. It's Rachel.
It's very simple how you square the circle. You get productivity improvements.
Well, hang on. Let me put that to Stephen. Hang on. Let me put that to Stephen Griffiths. Has that happened? Where's the productivity that suddenly emerged from the public sector in Scotland?
Our neighbours are so much more productive than we are. Our neighbours who remained in the single market and the customs union. Our neighbours who are in the European Union. But that is macroeconomic policy is set at Westminster.
Yes, but come on, you're in charge. You're in charge of the health service and have been. You decided to settle on improvements. Hang on, let me get the question out. On improvements to people's wages. Has there been productivity increases?
Well,
no.
There haven't been any strikes. And what's another? And I'm astonished to listen to a Labour colleague and a little bit disappointed when you have that slightly more progressive taxation system in Scotland. In the limited areas where we have power, very limited, where those in the lowest salaries pay a little bit less, those who are paid more pay a little bit more. That was our answer to austerity.
And look at the state of your health service, and look at the state of your failing education system under your control.
Elsewhere. And on the EU that you wanted to come out of,
have you heard that Germany's in recession?
Talked about economic
Germany's in recession? Have you heard that Germany's in recession? Seriously,
if I may,
you can't claim that
Don't talk over Stephen, please. Just let him finish and I'll come back to you.
That is a structural issue that's caused £140 billion since, and we're not solving it. And why on earth Labour have moved away from rejoining the customs union in the single market is beyond me, when we know that as a structural issue. It's got nothing to do with Germany.
Let Sarah answer that. Recess, Jo.
Yeah, well, it's coming tomorrow. Hold on. How do you feel about that closer relationship with the EU? Would you like to see the UK get so close that they're almost back in the single market?
We know that we have to work closely with our European colleagues. We have to make sure that where we're looking towards growth, we're finding ways of renegotiating any of those agreements with trade that we can. And we have set out that we will be doing that because some of those are up for rediscussions anyway. And Keir Starmer has very clearly said that he will be doing that because we cannot work as an island. We do need to work with them. But we have set out we're not going to be rejoining the customs union or to be looking to rejoin Europe. You know, we have to make sure that we try to make the best of this situation. And that is through those closer ties, good discussions and making sure that we have good diplomacy with our neighbours.
Can I just turn to you, Richard, in terms of some of the proposals that Reform UK put forward when it came to the NHS? I should say. Because Nigel Farage, in the seven-way debate, suggested the UK could learn lessons from the French. He argued the current model was wrong, the funding model that we have here. The more money we spend, the less delivery we get. And the SNP, Stephen Flynn, intervened to suggest Mr Farage did not believe in the NHS. He said you want to privatise it. That is what you want to do. It already is. It already is.
That's absolutely nonsense. What it is, it was actually having an honest debate. Look, healthcare in this country, sadly, we're spending about the OECD average per head, but our outcomes are right at the bottom of the league tables. So we've got to have a grown-up discussion. We said...
Oh, so you could change the funding model. It would no longer be free at the point of use.
We said the NHS should be buying much more capacity from the independent sector, millions and millions of appointments, and guess what? Wes Streeting listened to us. He's copied our ideas. That's part of the plan. We need to use much more of the independent sector, much of which, by the way, is non-profit making, in order to bring waiting lists down. And people want that grown-up discussion. Still free at the point of delivery, of course.
Except he said, let's look at the lessons from the French, where they have a social insurance model.
It's just one example of it, right? Just one example. But if you're not prepared to say other people are doing much better than we are, other people don't have waiting lists, then actually we're never going to make progress. Actually, Wes Streeting, to his credit, listened to some of the things we were putting forward and is actually looking to buy millions of appointments from the independent sector. Quite rightly, we need much more of that, and that independent sector will grow, still free at the point of delivery.
All right. Dr David Bull, actually, from Reform UK, said Nigel Farage was wrong in terms of citing social insurance model, but I take what you have just said. Now, we can confirm junior doctors offered new pay deal in England. The government and the BMA trade union expected to confirm junior doctors in England have struck this improved pay deal. It's thought to represent a 22.3% pay rise over 2 years, and That will be an end to the strikes. Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Mail. GPs threaten catastrophic industrial action, which could slash the number of their daily appointments by up to a half. Now, they are being balloted today. Should they get the same pay deal as the junior doctors, Sarah?
Well, this is for negotiation. The GPs at the moment are right on the front line. Yeah. They are dealing with all of the issues that people have.
So why shouldn't they get the same?
They are struggling with that. Well, I think they've laid out a number of different challenges to general practice, and some of that also involves the investment in practices, the investment in technology, the ways that they can see the number of patients that they are trying to see. But we've actually seen less GPs continuing to stay in the profession and less GPs go into the profession. So there is a crisis in general practice.
Yeah, and would you...
So we need to make sure that when we're discussing with them, it's about what can be achieved and what that longer-term plan is for primary care and our NHS.
All right.
And some of those things will take time, but it's about Wes Streeting. He's already met with them 3 times ahead of the 29th, which is when the ballot closes. So I'm sure that his discussions will be reassuring to them in that he is listening. But it's not for me to negotiate live on air on these.
Oh, go on.
No.
Well done for trying, Richard, at least. Right, let's have a look at this in the Times. We'll talk about the Tory leadership contest because Kemi Badenoch, here she is. She's entered the contest. She is the 6th. Her headline here in this opinion piece, people won't vote for us if we don't know what we want to be. The Conservatives must rebuild their party from top to bottom, says the leadership hopeful. Let's talk to the political editor of The Spectator, Katie Balls. Katie, 6 candidates now in the race. What do you make of what's on offer?
I think so far it's pretty much as expected. There isn't really a rogue candidate. Now, of course, we have about an hour or so before the deadlines close. Probably the most newsy thing that's happened is Suella Braverman has confirmed she does not have sufficient support to proceed. So she did have 10 MPs, so we don't know who they were, or perhaps, what school they went to. But it looks like a 6-horse race. And I think it is Kemi Badenoch, who, as you say, declared in the Times, but handed in her form last week, who is currently the one to beat.
Right. If it's whittled down, which it will be, to 2, which 2 are the most likely, do you think, to go to the membership?
Well, you start to get into a sense of where do MPs sit, because ultimately MPs will knock them out in various stages, down to 4, then there's party conference, then down to 2. I think Kemi Badenoch stands a good chance. The question is, some of her colleagues love that she is straight talking. Others find it slightly abrasive. So, does she keep everyone on side in terms of the campaign? And then I think that there's a question which is, can someone like James Cleverly or Tom Tugendhat pitch themselves as the One Nation candidate, almost the centre and centre-left of the Tory party, and get lots of numbers? It really depends who Kemi Badenoch is getting, because if Kemi Badenoch starts taking those MPs, you could have someone like Robert Jenrick potentially come in because they are winning mainly the support of the right. So I think it's a battle for the One Nation side. Do they have enough support for one candidate, or do the right get in? And then I think it's more hard to predict with the membership.
Katie, stay with us for the discussion because we're going to show you a little bit from Kemi Badenoch's article in The Times. This is her diagnosis in a nutshell. If we have a look here, some will argue our loss was down to this policy, that person or some decision. The truth is our policy offer was incoherent and we could not articulate why conservatism should matter to our fellow man. In The Times. Was she right?
Well, if you excuse me, I'm just going to get my forms in. I've got less than an hour.
Can we just say Mims Davis is announcing she's running for the leadership? We take you at face value.
No, in all seriousness, I've never felt so popular, Katie. That's what I can tell you in the party. Look, I'm delighted that Kemi's running. I'm delighted that we're seeing James and Pretty and Mel and Tom and I can't remember everyone's names.
So many you can't remember, yeah. But who are you backing?
At the moment, and I've promised this to my constituents and to my local team, that I would wait to see who's out of the blocks, that we would spend the summer listening and engaging. And actually, I think Kemi's really right. You've got to actually show what Conservative politics means, how it connects to people, particularly young people. We've got to make sure our offer is right. We've got to redefine ourselves, because many of us will have seen the politics and the impact of what we've been going through these last few years because of the pandemic. That might not be the Conservative Party that they're looking for. So let's use this as a time to re-examine and renew.
But Mims, when Kemi Badenoch says the truth is our policy offer was incoherent and we could not articulate why conservatism should matter to our fellow man, both you and her were part of that government. If you were so unhappy at the time, why did you stay?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I mean, we know we're here on the mainstream media. There's a lot of media, TikTok, other things out there to try and get your message across to. And I think that's really important, particularly for young people.
But was it incoherent? Was Rishi Sunak's government incoherent?
She's not going to write everything in the garden was roses, is she? Because it's not going to get into the papers and it's not going to connect with people. But I can tell you, some of my local councillors have said to me that's exactly what we need to be doing, is really explaining Conservative values, really showing what we mean when we get match fit for coming back into government, in the way that ultimately the Labour Party looked down and out, 5 years ago. We've got to make sure that we don't, end up looking that way, and actually we come back, we continue to use this time in opposition as constructive and explain those Conservative
Well, you've
values.
got quite some time until a new leader is picked. I mean, Katie, yes, I know, it's going on till the 2nd of November. Let's remind everyone. Just briefly, Katie,
I thought you meant opposition, not the leadership.
Well, the leadership's still quite long. Katie, listening to Mims, though, is that going to be a problem for Kemi Badenoch saying that it was incoherent, the government of which she was part?
I think that you will definitely see candidates like Robert Jenrick, who obviously quit Rishi Sunak's government over the Rwanda bill, try to suggest that those, he remained in the cabinet, perhaps, complicit in some of the result that came. But likewise, I think some of the candidates in the cabinet will point to those who they think were, disruptive on the outside and say maybe the problem was Tory psychodrama and did resignations and so forth add to that. So I think you get back to there is going to be a general blame game through this contest, and all the candidates will have different reasons the Tories lost, and it depends where you stick to it. You obviously can't be too critical of the government you served in, but you have to distance yourself a bit from Rishi Sunak really to argue you should be the one succeeding him, because continuity, Rishi Sunak is not going to win the contest.
Well, let's look at someone else who also left the government. The Daily Telegraph headline, you've mentioned her. I've been branded mad, bad and dangerous by my own party, so I will not lead it, says Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary. Is she mad, bad and dangerous, Mims?
Well, I've always found her extremely pleasant, and certainly nothing like that. I know she has really strong convictions.
Is she too dangerous? Is she too dangerous? Are her views too dangerous for the Conservative Party?
I think she's strident, and, if you look at what Labour did at the end of last week, scrapping the free speech opportunities in our universities, I think we have got to the point that if you are strident in your views, particularly as a woman, very often the negative adjectives come with it.
Right.
And if Kemi and Suella believe in what they believe in, there's absolutely no reason that they cannot be strident and come out and
persuade her
have
to
those
stand.
views.
You've got an hour or so to persuade her to stand, should she?
Look, for me, actually, I would go completely the opposite, and I'd be interested to see what Katie says. I would like to see a very broad church, a pragmatic, low tax, small state. You can see the big state is coming at you with Labour. We've got to explain the difference, and actually why Conservative values are actually very much what young people agree with and aspire to. And I think if we can have that kind of really positive policy conversation, then it's going to be 4 months well spent. But, blue on blue is not going to help anyone.
Well, that depends on where you're sitting, I suppose.
Indeed.
Would you have, talking of shades of blue, would you have Suella Braverman in Reform UK?
Look, I don't give a running commentary on any discussions about anybody who...
Oh, but there are discussions, are there?
I don't give a running commentary on anything like that. I've had a very consistent position. But the interesting thing is, the reality about this is that no one cares. I think tens of million people don't care about who's going to be the next Tory leader. I think they're done with broken promises, all the waffle, and that's why actually they got ousted in a very, very significant way at the election, and why over 4 million
people...
people...
Well, you say you're not going to give a running commentary. I wasn't asking you to give a running commentary. I was just asking you whether you... No, but where you personally, would you just welcome her? Would she be welcome or not?
It's interesting that she's very popular amongst the Conservative membership, we're told. And yet it seems amongst the parliamentary party, we're told she says she's not popular. Frankly, I don't think anybody cares about this. This will be a sort of an internal psychodrama for months.
Would she be welcome or not? If she decided, you'd have to tell me whether there are discussions, if she decided that that's what she wanted to do, would she be welcome or wouldn't she?
I'm not giving a running
We
commentary
know
on anything
Conservative
like that.
voters stayed at home. It's right that we look at why and listen and engage and use this time. I think it's obvious that the infighting on the doorsteps came, top of conversation, and actually we all need to take responsibility for that.
Well, somebody that fights elections against the Conservatives, I was bitterly disappointed that Suella Braverman dropped out this morning, but I'm sure they'll service up another topper because there are some fundamental...
Well, Stephen, you can intrude on private grief all you like. Katie, can I just ask you about Suella Braverman in terms of her future? I mean, is there a chance that she might look to reform?
So supporters of Suella Braverman have often tried to play down that idea, but I think you do look at her comments about ultimately feeling as though her party does not want her. And I think there is a question, does that just put you naturally on a path where the idea of defecting starts to look more appealing? I also think, depending on how she speaks now, if she makes comments that upset parts of her party, I think you'll have Tory MPs on the centre-left of the party saying to the new leader, why don't you stamp your authority by removing the whip from Suella Braverman to show you have a grip? So I think there's two tensions to look out for in terms of her next steps.
Katie Balls, thank you very much. Let's move on to this headline. BBC News, government delays university free speech fines. Controversial new powers for universities and student unions to be fined for failing to uphold freedom of speech have been put on hold by the government. The Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, said that would allow time to consider whether the law, which was due to come into force next week, would be repealed. There is a sense that they want the office, which actually looks after students, the Office for Students, to be sharply focused on the financial stability of universities. Now, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act was passed last year, said universities had a duty to secure and promote the importance of freedom of speech and academic expression. This is the Telegraph response. Scrapping cancel culture law puts campus free speech in peril. Labour is warned. Sarah, will this put free speech on campus in danger?
I don't think it does. I think what we have had is lots of different groups, minority groups, student unions saying that we're not even sure how we can possibly implement this. And actually, there's a great fear that it does the opposite and actually can potentially target people. So this has been put on pause so it can be analysed. And what we need to do is get back to making sure that our education is able to do what it needs to do and make sure that people can take part in that, but without putting an undue burden and trying to solve something that wasn't really a problem in the first place.
Oh, it wasn't a problem.
It's a massive problem. The truth is, many politicians, we haven't been able to go and speak in certain universities because we have the wrong views. And that therefore, actually, instead, debate and discussion. And what academic institutions have been doing is they've been telling you what to think as opposed to teaching you how to think. And that's what they should do. And I think this is an absolute disaster. It's not just within academic institutions, it's also within the public sector institutions, within Quangos, and indeed, it's happening elsewhere. And I think this is a really, really bad trend if you believe in transparency and democracy.
I've just been working in the higher education sector and I've never known people to have their free speech curtailed. I will tell you what you get. You get speech as long as it is something that is well researched and sourced and you're respectful to your colleagues. So I think saying, for example, that we never knew about the 18 billion quid, I'm not sure what the source for that is. That might have had an implication. But universities are bastions of free speech. Disagreeing with each other, as we are all doing today, is the way in which you advance your politics. It's why democracies are better than autocracies.
Sure. Now this is for England. This is for England only, just to be clear.
And we do know that the Home Secretary tried to ban previous peaceful marches because she didn't agree with them, calling them hate marches. Now, would this fall foul
because
of that kind of...
Because they were pro-Hamas.
Well, there would be others who disagree, but would this fall foul of this legislation?
Have you been on any of those marches?
It's not something
I've been on 4 of them, and let me tell you, they are hate-filled and they are anti-Semitic, and they're breaking the law.
Look, and I think where you're breaking the law in terms of breach of the peace, or where there is hate legislation, I'm sure you would have welcomed Scotland's hate crimes legislation on that, now that you've come to it. I think that when we're able to debate and discuss issues, as you do in a democracy, where you open that up, it makes policy making better. And that makes us all feel a wee bit more uncomfortable sometimes, but maybe that's better for the end point.
Mims?
Sounds like university for wallflowers, doesn't it? I mean, I went to a great university. I was never told what to think. I did politics and international relations. Thank you very much, Swansea University, for that. But, you know, this was slipped out as a written ministerial statement on a Friday. And I think we've all got a point here that it should be well researched. We should have a right to offend. But ultimately, it should be you should be able to go to university and not told what to think. You should be learning to think in the way that Richard said. And it even goes back to the previous item about how people are described and how people are shut down. The Lib Dems just recently, you know, had someone where a lady was standing up for women in that party, and then she was, you know, disregarded. We've got to get to a point where we can have honest conversations within the law, and our students, our future, should be as confident as we have been, you know, to come on this programme and learn that through universities. So I'd really like, Labour didn't like this when we brought it through. I'd really like them to rethink and perhaps listen and engage with the argument.
Sarah?
That's a good thing, right?
Well, it's been paused. That's exactly what they're doing. They're reviewing it. It's not, you know, there's no decision that has been made yet. But
Where
actually,
are you
it's
on
about...
it? Wait, do you think it should still stand? Do you think it should be unpaused?
I think it's right to review it because otherwise... Because we don't actually think it's going to bring about the problem solving to a problem that we're not sure was really there. That also
there wasn't a problem of speakers being no platformed or...
Well, we also have to think about those groups who feel threatened and vulnerable. So we know that the Jewish community have come forward and said that they were highly concerned about that. So therefore, we have to make sure that we're listening. We cannot just ram-raid things through when we've got the opportunity to take a step back and to pause this and to consider the actual implications, when really our further education, we need to be focusing on making sure it's funded properly and that students are getting the best education that they can.
Well, that's certainly the reason that's been put forward. What do you say to Sarah's point that there were groups, Jewish students, worried that perhaps Holocaust deniers would be allowed to come and speak unless there was some sort of legislation to limit it?
From what I've understand from the Jewish community and Jewish students is exactly the opposite, that they were being harassed because of their religious views. They weren't being allowed to put their side of the argument. Surely the right thing to do is actually try it for a period of time, Sarah, and then see. And if it's not working, tweak it and adapt it. That, rather than just pause the whole thing, I think that's just a better way of approaching it. If you've got concerns about it...
It's not that easy to change legislation. I know you've just come, but it's not that easy to change legislation.
Well, and I have to say, to be fair
to Bridget Phillipson, I think that reset in relationships with universities south of the border has been badly needed. Our higher education sector is world leading. You can't say that for every sector. It is world leading, with people coming from around the world to study.
But why can't you do this with this legislation?
And work here, because I think it's one of these things that you're trying to penalise people, that you're bringing in legislation. It seems heavy-handed. We haven't needed it in Scotland. And actually, it's a bit like the photo ID that stopped people from voting. There was all this heavy-handed legislation that came in at the fag end of a Tory government. And I think Labour are right to put a stop to it. So, you know, we've disagreed
on... They say they haven't put a stop to it, that they are pausing it.
Pauses and secret scrappings and, you know, reviewing and all of that. So let's just see, you know,
isn't that what a new government does when they come in after 14 years?
I think it's right to have a rethink, but slipping out a WMS at the end of the week on free speech without debating it in Parliament and bringing it to Parliament to be questioned, I think is questionable.
Should Parliament have a say on this?
Well, we've paused it, and it's for Bridget Phillipson to lay out whether or not there will be progress on that. So we can wait for her statement to, you know, about this.
Yeah, and then should MPs have another say on it?
I think they may well do, but, you know, we have to wait. It's for Bridget Phillipson to lay those things out alongside the Leader of the House in terms of how business is going to be set out.
I mean, in terms
of first instance, I think it's to take that pause, to take a step back, which is what we're doing on a number of different areas, to make sure that we've got the best picture, to make the best decisions for how we go forward for this country.
I mean, what evidence was there that there was a huge problem with this, which is what Labour is intimating, that this was more about culture wars than what's really facing universities, and that's their finances?
Well, I mean, I think you're right about... if it's going to be paused, let's look at the evidence that apparently Labour have found. But let's go back to previously where they were voting against it and stopping this. So is this really an open-minded decision, to your point about resetting relationships with higher education? But as Richard said, many people who have wanted to hear different voices in university settings have been stopped from being heard. That doesn't sound like promoting the chance to learn and decide yourself in the way that Richard...
Well, we've got Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor's statement this afternoon. We'll be covering it tomorrow on Politics Live, the last one before the summer recess. I will be back, but thank you to all of my guests. What do you mean few about Politics Live, about the recess?
Recess.
Bye.